Welcome to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
At EPLA, we seek to support women and families suffering early pregnancy loss by providing resources, education, and community. It is our vision that no one suffers miscarriage alone. Welcome back to Hope Blooms. I'm Emily Carrington, EPLA's Executive Director. And with me today is my brother-in-law, Nick Carrington, who has served as one of our blog editors, but also, obviously, a major support when it comes to friends and family. So welcome, Nick.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Emily.
I'm excited to talk to you specifically today. We've had on our podcast women who have gone through miscarriages, women who have, developed support organizations much like ours. And I think that it's really important, especially as we move into this holiday season where we're spending lots of time with friends and family, to talk specifically to those friends and family and get a little bit of that perspective of your own experience walking through loss with your friends and family, as well as sort of then what role you can play in that. So I want to back up and talk a little bit about what has your exposure and unfortunate introduction to miscarriage?
Yeah, this is something that really surprised me as I got older, and I think that's part of the problem that the EPLA has tried to address, and I think that we're making progress on, is I just had no idea how common this would be. And so I thought once I hit the stage where friends and family were having children that I might not encounter anyone who had experienced miscarriage, just because it's something that no one really talked about growing up. But as I got to that stage, I've had numerous people, colleagues and friends and family, all experiencing miscarriage. And I think every year since I've been about that age where friends and family started trying to have children, I've had at least a couple people convey that they've had a miscarriage. And so it's kind of been all around me. And one of the reasons that I wanted to get involved in the EPLA is I instantly saw the need for awareness. I saw the need for people to understand the issue better and then know how to address it from a friends and family perspective. And so just had a lot of people around me that I care about who've dealt with that tragedy.
So obviously, Nick is my brother-in-law. He's my husband's brother. Was our miscarriage your first exposure sort of as friends and family, or was there?
I think yours was the first major one in my life. The time's a flat circle. It's hard to keep track of because it's been a while. Right. But I think that's the major one that really, really hit me hard. And then not long after that, my sister-in-law on my wife's side miscarried. And that was a significant event as well. But I think yours was the biggest one, especially because my wife was pregnant at the same time. And there was a lot of excitement around that. So that was the first big instance of miscarriage that I look back on and say that really, really affected me.
I want to talk a little bit about that time. I think it's easy to, you've written some of this and you've stepped up and talked about this and you're here doing these things with our organization. I think it's easy to sort of relegate the friends and family to the support people. And I certainly think the feelings that the mother is having and the father is having, and that's sort of, it's all kind of like a tornado or a cyclone where like the world is out of control. But can you talk a little bit more about your own emotions, not necessarily as a support person, but your own experience and perhaps even your own loss as you're watching, siblings on both sides of the family walk through this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was thinking about that recently. And so I mentioned that my wife was pregnant at the same time as you, Emily. And so a few things during that time. First, seeing you guys in pain was significant. And I know that's not what you're asking about, but that was the biggest thing, was that you were in pain and that we had lost a niece or nephew. And so family has always been really important to me, and I've always had this vision of being really close to nieces and nephews and wanting to be a part of their life and being a particular type of uncle to them. And so when that has happened and I've lost 4 nieces or nephews, those were really significant to me. And those, I had to grieve on my own about them. I certainly didn't want to make those situations about me because, as you said, the mother and father are dealing with a unique pain in that circumstance. But my wife and I we were in a grieving process along with trying to be part of whatever we could to be part of the healing process. And so one of the things I've thought about recently is I've always seen my brother Adam, your husband, as a source of wisdom. And I remember thinking that becoming new parents together, going through that process, maybe muddling through that process together, was going to be really, really helpful for me, in that he was someone that I could lean on during that process as I was trying to figure things out. And that didn't happen the way that we had hoped. So I think 2 significant things were that I needed to grieve on my own and realize what it meant for our family too, that our cousins weren't going to grow up together in the same way that we had envisioned, and that we had lost something as well. But also, our family didn't have the same type of support that we expected as we thought, when we thought that you all were going to go through some of the same stages of parenting and figuring those things out as we did. And so that all of that was tough, and it's hard in the moment. It's hard to make sense of all that at one time. It's just a rush of feelings and anxiety and pain. And I think it's taken time for me to tease some of those things out as to why I felt the way I did.
Yeah, I think that's probably really, really common with grief. And yeah, it's just such a weird, disorienting time, as is becoming a new parent at the same time. But I think what you said, and I think it's right, to be careful to not try to take grief from another, or grief, but at the same time, or make it about you. But at the same time, I think one thing, and I don't know how we talk about this. I don't know how I would have necessarily even received it at the time. But we talked about in our last episode, I talked a bit about that first Thanksgiving. Well, you guys were having a baby, and all the excitement that went with that, and how that actually in some ways helped me work through my grief. But also this idea of Thanksgiving and Christmas. And when you lose a loved one, right? The first Thanksgiving after your grandfather or grandmother weren't at the table, the whole table missed them. And I think there's a sense from grieving parents, especially in miscarriage, when no one has met the baby, we're the only ones missing this baby. This is sort of our loss. No one else knew this baby. No one else is sharing about this baby. So I think there is it's hard. I don't know exactly how you navigate it or talk about it as a family. But I think there's something to knowing that other people miss my babies. I like that. And that helps them. One thing I was really scared about was that my children would be forgotten, that they'd have sort of no space. And to take that burden off of just Adam and I, that we're the only people that remember them, is comforting. Not that we want everyone to suffer too, but to know that we're not the only ones missing something, I think is an interesting and an important part. And that's something we talked about too in our early podcasts with Nancy Kingma is, others grieve, the grandparents grieve, the family grieves. And I think that's part of too why I would just love to see more communal grieving on miscarriage in the first place, more, funeral or prayer or memorial services where the others can come around and say, this is our loss too. And so I think that's pretty profound. And now 8 years out, comforting to hear.
I think that's an excellent point. I think there is an appetite for that. I think that a lot of people want to grieve and mourn with those who are mourning. I think part of the problem, I think this is with every kind of death, is people grieve differently. And sometimes you don't know whether bringing it up is just going to cause more pain, or whether they want to talk about it in any given circumstance, or what those rituals should be to do that wisely and well, so that you are not opening up a scab that you don't want to, but you are also remembering the child and grieving the child, and making it known that even though we didn't have the types of interactions we wanted to with that child was part of our family, and that we loved them. And so I don't think that's terribly different from other forms of grief, where you're not sure when somebody's parent or grandparent died, how much you should bring it up, or when you should talk about it. But I think it's an important thing to work through on an individual basis with the grieving parents.
Yeah, and I think it's good for the grieving parents, as a grieving parent, to, I don't want to burden anyone with more to do, but to step back and see. It can be really easy to sort of assume that assume perhaps that you are the only one hurting, and to sort of assume what everyone else is feeling, and to step back and realize that this isn't only your loss. Just like when a baby is born, it isn't only your gain. Of course, everybody's excited. So look around, and this may be my advice to grieving parents this Thanksgiving and Christmas, as your heart hurts and you feel really lonely, look at every person who was excited, who would have been excited for a new baby. And they're probably the ones who also are hurt and are missing your baby too. What do you think? So as you guys, what were some ways that you and Rachel were sort of able to work out and better understand that grief for yourselves?
That's a great question. I think we had to navigate those tricky waters, like you said, that we were going to have a baby, and so there were some weird feelings. There was a lot of excitement on our end for what we were heading into and what we were going to experience, and there was also pain at not being able to experience that with you all and losing someone. And so I think I remember a lot of helplessness that I had to work through. I had to come to terms with the fact that I couldn't fix anything. This was not something that you could fix. And that part of my grieving process needed to be figuring out a way, in a healthy way for everyone involved, for me to be a small part of the healing process, whatever I could do, even from a distance. And so I think that was a big thing for us, is we wanted to be part of that healing process, and we wanted to figure out a way to do that without causing any damage or more pain. And again, that was kind of tricky because we were pregnant and in the midst of getting ready to have a child. And so I think processing all that and then figuring out those steps, what I came to understand is that even easing small burdens for someone who is in pain is a significant thing. We think of, with the term burdens, we think that it has to be something big that you're lifting from someone. But when someone's grieving and in pain, even small things, even making lunches and cutting grass and making dinner, those types of things become significant. And so if we as loved ones can do small things to help those who are grieving, I think it also helps in our grieving process to recognize that we are part of, hopefully, the healing of that couple.
I think that's good. And I think you're right. It gives you somewhere to put that energy and care.
Yeah.
I want to talk now a little bit about, we've talked about you and your wife, but how have you addressed this with your children? When did you tell them? What have you told them? How has it become part of your own family culture? You may have done a better job at this with your own kids than I have.
Yeah. I don't even know if we have probably told the 3-year-old, but I'm sure that's long gone from his memory. I think when they got old enough to understand, I have a child who's about to be 8 and a child who is 6. And I think, especially when we get together with either my sister-in-law on Rachel's side or with you all, one of the things we tell them is that until we get to heaven, this family won't be complete. That there was a child that we loved, even though they never got to play with them, that we still grieve. And every November, this is when it really hits me, because I remember your due date in November, and our son's birthday was in November, and so it hits me in a special way. But yeah, we try to explain to them who was lost, that they were part of our family, that they were loved, and that I think it's strange for them, but that we miss them in a way. We miss what's not there and what we never got to experience, and that they were valuable to us. And so for their age, it's really basic things. I don't think they understand a lot of the detail surrounding that, but they understand that people in our family are no longer there, and that we have grieved them and that we love them.
I think it's sort of neat when talking to kids. We've only told our 5-year-old, our 2-year-old has no space for that right now, as your 3-year-old. But I think it's kind of neat, at least with our 5-year-olds, that it's not, there's some sort of awe and wonder. I think she understands a little bit of the sadness, but there's sort of like, hey, there's some more. We're missing some. And there's it's interesting because it is not something that bothers her. I think the way you talk about it is important, and we've talked about it with her very similarly. But I think ultimately sharing that and letting her be a part of that, I've just been really sort of blessed by her ease and calm. She likes thinking about, I had a brother. We do know at least one loss was a boy, and that's something she just really likes thinking about and sort of imagining. And I think there's something sweet there that someday she may understand more. But I think there's a sweetness in involving children in that conversation, and that it doesn't have to be sort of burdening sadness upon them. They'll sort of take it in the way they're appropriate, the way they're capable.
What I do appreciate about my almost 8 and 6-year-old is, when we've talked about in the past, we've taught them to hold family in high regard. And so they're not particularly burdened about it, but they understand how important it is that they had cousins that they'll never play with. And because cousins are a special part of their life, and when they get to see cousins, I think even more than their friends that they see every day at school, or we have a lot of kids who live on our street, cousins are special to them. And I think it's because we've instilled the idea that family is important. So they get extra excited when they see cousins. And I think they've internalized that the fact that there are cousins that they never got to meet and play with, that's important. And so I like that. I like the way that they have processed that and talk to us about it.
Yeah. Well, I want to move towards talking about, we've talked a little bit about this, but sort of just what, advice for the other support people. I've talked to some people, and I think, that if you haven't been through this loss, especially for those who haven't been through it themselves, I want to talk a little bit about that perspective. But I will also say, just because I've been through 3 losses, I often find myself not sure what to do when someone experiences a loss. Like you said, people grieve differently. We want to give space. There's all these reasons I think we can sort of run out of ideas. And I think we've done a lot of really good work on the blog trying to sort of generate, here are things you can do. But what is your role, your experience supporting friends and family? What are some of the things? I know we talked about easing their physical burdens with meals, chores. What are some other things that you've experienced have sort of been a way to help?
Yeah. Besides easing some of those physical burdens, I think one of the things is to partake in some of the grieving rituals that you go through in culture. And so that might look differently from you, whether that is cards or flowers or whatever you do when someone is grieving the loss of a loved one, to reinforce that you understand they have lost a child and that you're affirming that life and that you want to remember that child. I think it's healthy to go through some of those same rituals for those people.
Well, and even, let me interrupt there, as a support person, because we haven't normalized those rituals yet fully for miscarriage, I needed someone to tell me to do those things. I wandered around for 3 days before a good friend of mine said, I think you need to do something to memorialize this baby. And I was like, that's a great idea. I never thought of that. And the relief that brought my heart, I had never thought of it. I just couldn't think of it. So I do think it sounds easy. It may sound too obvious, but if your friend is saying, I don't know what to do, I think offering some of those rituals is a good idea.
I think
so. I'm sorry.
No, I think part of the issue there is that a lot of times part of those rituals are memories that we've shared with that person, and that's lacking in this case. We have dreams of what our relationship would be with that little one and what that would look like. And maybe those are good things to share. I'm not sure. But there's a piece of that missing that we're not used to. And also, still, people seem so surprised by it, even though it's so common. And so I don't know if I don't think they know how to react in those situations. But I think that's a good thing to do, is perform some of those rituals, because I think it reinforces to the family, one, that you care, and two, that you recognize that they had a child that they no longer have. And that's significant. I think that's something you can do in the immediate aftermath. I think it's important, and I want to do a better job at this too, is to do things maybe every year or regularly to remember that child, to not just do some of those rituals in the aftermath, but to do things to remember that child long term and to recognize that they're not there. I know you mentioned Thanksgiving might be a good time for a family when you get together, or Christmas when you get together, to do some of those things, but I think that's an important thing. And then finally, one of those things is just be, especially in the immediate aftermath, but all the time, be willing to listen more than speak. I think that feeling of helplessness that I described earlier, it causes us to sometimes say things that are well-intended that are not helpful. And so one of those things, as an example, is, oh, you're young, there's a good chance you'll get pregnant again. And I think people are well-intended when they say things like that, but it kind of dismisses the humanity of the child that was just lost.
Well, yeah, and the whole experience of the mother. I think one thing, we kind of forget that she may have, miscarriage is pre-20 weeks. She may, whether she carried this baby for 4 or 20 weeks, there's a whole experience there, and then the loss itself, so I think you're right. We need to be careful to not just dismiss that whole experience.
Yeah. And not just the loss of the child, but also as some people have written about on the blog, and we know it's a traumatic experience too. And comments like that trivialize the mother's physical and emotional and spiritual trauma that they've gone through too. And so I think just being willing to listen, saying, hey, I'm so sorry. I'm here if you want to talk. We're grieving with you, accompanied with easing some of those burdens if you can, and going through some of those rituals that occur around death. I think those are good places to start.
I think that's all really, really good advice. Just having honest conversations. I remember I just wanted to talk. I wanted to talk. I'm a verbal processor, and I don't even know exactly what I always wanted to say, and finding a way. I think there's some other ideas, Nick, you've led by a great example of getting involved with EPLA. Not everyone has to get as involved or, become the blog editor and run the blog, which has been great. But there's ways you can get involved in organizations, make a donation in memory of that loved one or in honor of the one who, things like that can really, really help families feel like they've been seen. So those are ways to, we have a care kit sponsorship program where you can sponsor a care kit either in memory or honor of a loved one. And I think those are ways to demonstrate that support and that you're coming around. So, well, thank you, Nick, so much. Did you have anything else to add before we wrap up today?
Yeah, as you made me think of this as a support person, as you're dealing with loved ones. I think we all have different gifts in terms of how we can ease burdens. And parents of miscarried children, they have physical trauma and they have emotional trauma and they have spiritual trauma. And maybe you are better adept at being part of the healing process for one of those over the other. I think that's okay. What we need is community of people to come around them who have those different gifts and different resources to love on them during that time. And so I don't think you have to feel like you have to carry all of those burdens, but I do think it's healthy to aim to be part of that process.
I think that's well said. And I think you're right. I think it's really easy when anyone is experiencing some sort of trauma or grief or difficult situation to think, I don't have the time, I don't have the money, I don't have the resources to provide. And I have realized in my own life, to actually look around and see what it is I have, as opposed to think about adding, a burden to me. Maybe making dinner for a family is really I don't have time to go to the grocery store. Maybe that is really a big burden right now. So realizing those things, but then looking around and realizing, or maybe when you are at I'm at the grocery store right now, what do you need? What is it that you have an abundance? And you probably have an abundance of something, even if it's not resources. So I think that there's ways you can just look around at your own experience and what you have and what your own gifts are. So, well, Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. I think this was a very good and important conversation of part of walking through loss and finding healing. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Emily. It's a pleasure to be part of the organization. I think we're doing excellent work.
Really appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all for listening. This has been an episode of Hope Blooms. Thank you for listening to Hope Blooms, a podcast from the Early Pregnancy Loss Association.
To learn more about how we and you can support women suffering early pregnancy loss, visit our website at miscarriagecare.com or find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thank you for listening.